So at this stage, Dad, who was in the Royal Marines, was being off serving in various places like Aden and stuff like that. And he did a stint in Singapore. And so it was when the family came. So my brother was first. He was born in 1958. And then we had a brother, Timothy, who was born, I think, in 60. And he died very soon after birth.
9 days he was only alive, yes.
So we're all looking forward to meeting Timothy in the next world.
Yes, indeed.
And
Timothy Michael, I think it was.
Timothy Michael,
yes.
yes. And then I came along in 61. We were living in the south of England. Chris, my brother, used to refer to the houses as the house with the blue door and the house with the green door, and I never knew what he was talking about. All I can remember was it was very cold. And but back in 1964, Dad had been he'd been sent to Singapore for a permanent position, or a long-term position, where he was running a camp with about 500 people. I think it was Changi Camp, but I could be wrong.
Yes. That was the old Japanese camp that they,
so
which my Dad's father was, brother was in it all the time.
So that's Dad's uncle was actually in Changi during the Second World War as a prisoner. So I'm pretty sure we could be wrong in the detail, but we think this is right. And of course, the Royal Marines have a slightly different ranking system. So effectively, Dad, who was acting major, was equivalent to a colonel in the army. Anyway, so off we went to Singapore for the first time, tropical place, and we had some interesting times. We were there for 3 years, from 64 to 67, and
completely different lifestyle to when I was out there with my father.
You were in Singapore with your father?
Yes,
yeah, you were in South Africa.
South Africa with my father,
yes,
that's right. But so I was maybe in Singapore twice, so I can't think when the next one was. Anyway, never mind.
And it was difficult because it was a colonial experience where you had servants. And so we weren't used to this, so we just basically thought we had 2 sets of parents. It was great. It was a lovely Chinese family.
They spoiled them rotten.
Matriarch called Noi and her husband, the cook, Pang, and their children.
That's right, yeah.
And, Mum would be trying to get us to eat our greens, and as soon as her back was turned, they would disappear. Out would come fish fingers and all this sort of stuff. Spoiled us.
They were terrible, rotten. They really were.
And we had a lovely time in Singapore. We had the only time we ever had really any money in the family, and it was good. And it was when Singapore was just become independent from Malaysia. And so, of course, we need to go back a little bit. In England, after Mum became a Baha'i, it was before Shoghi Effendi passed away. And so various friends such as, is it Patricia Batrick?
Yes.
Who knew Shoghi Effendi, Owen and Patricia, they both came out to New Zealand. Went to see Shoghi Effendi. Mum sort of didn't work out, did it? Didn't quite at the time. But when
I don't think my parents. I don't think that Mike would like it either.
Not at that stage.
Yeah.
But of course, Mum was in England in '63 when I think it was the Baha'i World Congress, when the Hands of the Cause, who had been guiding the faith after the death of Shoghi Effendi and after the fact that there was no will and testament, they made sure that all these national spiritual assemblies were set up so that there could be this Congress to elect the first International House of Justice. And so Mum was there for that and went to it and knew a lot of the people. It was a much smaller world in those days, but there was lots of different people from all over the world.
Oh, yes, indeed. But we all remembered each other. It was just incredible when you think about it,
So anyway, out to Singapore. And of course, Singapore's now a new country and it needs an LSA. Well, it needs an NSA. So Mum was part of a small group of Baha'is. I forget the Indian lady, the very staunch one.
Oh, yes, I can see her, but I can't think of her name.
But Mrs. Lee was the Chinese lady, a very wealthy Chinese lady who used to have a lot of fun setting up my dad and various other people to have Baha'i arguments. But I can still remember, we lived in various houses in Singapore, And keep talking. The house that we last lived in was called Delvere Estate, and so this is sort of the view of it. And there's Dad and me to the right, and Chris to the left, and Mum in the background. And the Bukatima used to flood regularly. In that house in the background we had floods a third of the way up the wall. And there was a tiny little stair leading up to a loft, and so trying to get all the gear up there was a major exercise. But I remember we used to go to places in Malaysia, especially when Dad was suffering a bit from tropical diseases. And lovely places like, I think it was Port Jackson that we went to, but I can't remember the exact name. It was definitely west coast of Malaysia. But I can still remember when we went up to visit Mrs. Lee in her mansion up in the Highlands, in the Cameron Highlands.
Cameron Highlands, that's
and
right.
So we're driving along, and you know there was no air conditioning in any of the houses. The only air conditioning unit was in one restaurant in Singapore. And so all the wealthy Chinese ladies who used to wear mink stoles would have to go to this restaurant because it was the only place that they could wear them without boiling. And as we drove up to the Highlands, it got cold, and I can still remember putting on a jersey for the first time as we drove past these strawberry sellers on the side of the road.
That's right, yes.
Up to this ginormous mansion where, up in the hills, where there was a huge brass gong, which was they used to hit it when there was man-eating tigers turning up. So it was an interesting experience, and we really enjoyed it.
Mrs. Lee was an absolute sweetie. She knew so much about the faith, and she's very well educated, you know, far, far more than I'll ever be. And she was also a businesswoman. Most of the Chinese were, you know, they matched into it. But she never showed it off at all. But when you went shopping, if you went shopping with her, boy, did you get a good service.
Like many Chinese, Mr. Lee was a Chinese expatriate living in Singapore, and Mrs. Lee had been raised in Shanghai by her father, who was a Mandarin, and she was raised in a very modern way. She didn't have her feet bound. But I remember Mum telling me stories that she had told you about being carried on a sedan chair and peeking through the curtains at people dying on the streets, presumably in the 30s in Shanghai. And they knew that Japanese were coming during the Second World War, and they were going to go up into the Highlands, Cameron Highlands, but they came very quickly. And so Mrs. Lee and a very small number of staff, I think Mr. Lee might have died by then, after winning the Lee Pineapple and possibly the Straits Times in a game of Mahjong. Interesting. They set up camp in a warehouse down in the docks. And when the British prisoners of war were being worked around Singapore, she would send out a servant who would carry the wooden pole with 2 baskets on the end with rice in leaves, and would instruct him to trip and fall and to have all this food to fall amongst the prisoners of war. So she was a very interesting lady, very staunch. But I sort of knew Mrs. Noi, who was our Chinese cook, stood 5 foot nothing, and when she had her hair done up in a very tight bun, and one day she let it down to wash it, and I ran screaming to Mum saying, Noi's hair's falling out, because it touched the floor. That's how long it was. But after these periodic inundations of the Bukatima River, we'd watch the water go down, and I had a little newt net that I used to go around in the concrete behind the kitchen to try and catch newts. Managed to catch an eel about this long, and our Noi was so pleased. This was going to make a great meal. Put it in a bucket of fresh water to clean it out, and it died on her. You've never heard such language. She was swearing at this eel. How dare you die? So I have occasional memories, including one night. My brother and I decided we were going to sneak down into the kitchen and we were going to steal cheese. It seems to be the thing to do. So just as we reached the fridge, opened it up and reached for the cheese, Chinese New Year opened up with all these explosions and fireworks and just, we thought we'd been caught. I think Mum and Dad couldn't stop laughing about it for weeks. But the fireworks in those days were not PC at all. They had strings of firecrackers going off and stuff to scare away the demons. And some of the fireworks are the most amazing little parachutes and stuff. But of course my brother and I, the thing to do in Singapore was to go to the aquarium and also to the Chinese gardens, which were very interesting, set up by the lady who had the ointment, tiger balm ointment.
Oh, yes,
she made a lot of money. But one of the things in Chinese gardens is you've got to have heaven and hell. So for small boys, we thought this depiction of hell with stakes and people being impaled and disemboweled and blood and decapitated, that's what we wanted to see. This was cool. This was really good. So we'd go there for that.
And did you find it?
Oh, every time we went there, it was always there.
I can't remember that bit.
But Singapore changed a lot. But then, for various reasons that I'm very proud of, Dad got missed out on promotion, and so because he and Mum used to look after all the young lieutenants and their wives coming out to Singapore, rather than playing the political game of dinner parties for the general and stuff like that. And so once that happened, they decided that now was the time to come to New Zealand.